Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're journeying into the heart of colonial America, from the ancient indigenous civilizations that flourished for millennia before European arrival, through the tumultuous years of settlement and conflict, to the moment when 13 colonies stood on the precipice of revolution. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from. Get cozy, settle in, and let's begin. Long before the first European ships appeared on the horizon, long before the words New World were ever spoken, this continent teemed with life, civilization, and human achievement on a scale that would have astonished those who later claimed to discover it. The land we now call North America was not empty wilderness waiting for settlers. It was home to millions of people who had built societies as complex and sophisticated as any in Europe. Civilizations that had existed for thousands of years before Columbus ever set sail. Near modern-day St. Louis, where the Mississippi River bends and the floodplains stretch wide and fertile, stood a city that would have rivaled the great urban centers of medieval Europe. The indigenous peoples who built it left no written records, so we know it by the name archaeologists gave it in the 1800s. Cahokia, after an unrelated tribe that lived in the area when French explorers arrived centuries after the city's abandonment. But make no mistake, this was no small settlement. Archaeological evidence indicates that Cahokia's population exploded rapidly after 1050 CE. By 1100 to 1150 CE, researchers estimate the city was home to between 10,000 and 20,000 people in its central core alone, with some estimates suggesting that if we count suburban areas and satellite communities, the population may have reached as high as 40,000. This made Cahokia larger than London or Paris at the same time period. Think about that for a moment. While medieval Europe was emerging from the Dark Ages, while Norman kings were conquering England, a thriving metropolis stood in the American heartland, and most Europeans had no idea it existed. The city sprawled across nearly 6 square miles of carefully planned urban landscape, though the greater metropolitan area may have extended even farther. At its center rose Monk's Mound, a massive earthen structure that even today inspires awe in those who see it. This pyramid of packed earth covered more than 14 acres at its base and climbed approximately 100 feet into the sky in 4 enormous terraces. To put this in perspective, Monk's Mound's base is roughly the same size as the Great Pyramid of Giza. On its flattened summit stood temples and what archaeologists believe were the residences of the elite. Buildings that looked out over a city of thousands of homes, plazas, and at least 80 remaining smaller mounds out of an estimated 120 that once existed. The construction of Monk's Mound alone would have required the movement of more than 14 million baskets of earth, each one carried by human hands, each one placed with purpose and precision. Based on what we know about similar construction projects in other ancient societies, this suggests a highly organized labor force and centralized authority capable of coordinating thousands of workers over many years. Cahokia was not built haphazardly. The city planners, whoever they were, possessed knowledge of astronomy and engineering that manifested in every aspect of the urban design. They constructed what archaeologists call wood henge, a series of circular post structures made from red cedar, constructed at different times between 900 and 1100 CE. These circles varied in size from 12 to 60 posts and appear to have functioned as solar calendars, marking the solstices and equinoxes with remarkable precision. A priest or astronomer standing at the center could observe the sun rising at specific points along the horizon during important ceremonial times. During the equinox, the sun appears to rise directly from the top of Monk's Mound, an alignment that seems far too perfect to be coincidental. They aligned major structures with celestial events, embedding their cosmological beliefs into the very bones of their city. A grand causeway called the Rattlesnake Causeway stretched outward from the central plaza, aligned with the maximum southern moonrise in its 18.6-year cycle, its orientation deliberate, its meaning now lost to time, but clearly significant to those who walked it. The people of Cahokia were part of what we now call the Mississippian culture, a civilization that flourished across much of what is now the American Midwest, South, and Southeast, from around 800 CE to 1600 CE. This was not a unified empire in the European sense, but rather a network of related societies that shared similar ways of life, spiritual beliefs, and architectural traditions. They were farmers primarily, cultivating the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash. The agricultural revolution that swept through this region around 1000 CE allowed populations to grow and cities to rise. Trade networks connected Cahokia to distant regions. Archaeologists have found copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, mica from the Appalachians, and obsidian from the Rocky Mountains. Merchants traveled hundreds of miles along the rivers in enormous dugout canoes, some measuring 50 feet long and capable of carrying tons of goods. The city controlled production and distribution of Mill Creek chert, a high-quality stone used to make hoes, the essential tool for Mississippian agriculture. This gave Cahokia economic leverage across a vast territory. But Cahokia was more than an economic hub. It was a religious center, a place where thousands gathered for ceremonies and festivals that bound the community together. Excavations of one mound called Mound 72 revealed the burial of a man laid out on a bed of more than 20,000 shell beads, carefully arranged in the shape of a bird, likely a falcon or thunderbird, a powerful symbol in Mississippian cosmology. This bird imagery appears throughout Mississippian art, suggesting it may have represented elite power or a connection to the supernatural. Around this central burial were buried the bodies of young women, approximately 53 of them in 2 separate layers, along with other individuals in what appears to have been a massive sacrificial ceremony. The patterns of burial and the physical evidence suggest these were ritual killings associated with the death of this important person. Other mass graves at the site contained the remains of people whose hands had been removed or who showed signs of ritual execution. These discoveries speak to a society with rigid hierarchies and powerful religious beliefs, where rulers commanded not just labor, but life and death itself. The scale and nature of these burials tell us that Cahokia's elite possessed authority that went far beyond the political, extending into the spiritual realm that governed Mississippian life. Around 1200 CE, something changed. The city began to decline, though this was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual process that unfolded over more than a century. By 1350 CE, Cahokia was largely abandoned, its population dispersed, its mounds slowly being reclaimed by grass and trees. Why? Scholars have debated this for decades, and the truth is, we may never know for certain. The evidence points to multiple factors working together. Tree ring data shows that a severe drought struck the region between 1150 and 1350 CE, which would have made farming difficult and reduced crop yields. Archaeological evidence also suggests environmental degradation. The surrounding forests were cut down for building materials and fuel, leaving the land vulnerable to flooding. Without tree roots to absorb water, heavy rains would have caused the creeks and rivers to overflow, destroying crops and damaging homes. Recent excavations have revealed that the Cahokians tried to address these problems. They dug channels and built levees to control flooding. They began replanting forests in the uplands. They reorganized their agricultural system, planting fields in both lowland and upland areas to reduce the risk that a single flood would wipe out the entire harvest. But these efforts seem to have come too late. There's also evidence of social instability. The ritual structures and practices that had bound the community together appear to have changed dramatically in Cahokia's final century, which could suggest that people were losing faith in their leaders and in the religious system that legitimized those leaders' authority. Some researchers have proposed that as the elite lost control, civil unrest may have made people decide to leave for more promising locations. Others suggest that the rise of competing centers to the south drew people away. Whatever the combination of causes, by the time Europeans arrived in the region centuries later, Cahokia was gone, its story preserved only in the earth itself, waiting for archaeologists to uncover it. The Mississippian influence spread far beyond Cahokia. Other mound-building centers arose throughout the southeast: Moundville in Alabama, Etowah in Georgia, Spiro in Oklahoma. Each adapted Mississippian traditions to their own environments and needs. The descendants of these peoples, tribes like the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Cherokee, carried forward elements of their ancestors' culture, even as the great cities of the Mississippian period faded into memory. Far to the northeast, in the forested lands of what is now upstate New York, and extending into present-day Ontario and Quebec, another sophisticated political system was taking shape. The Haudenosaunee, known to Europeans as the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Five Nations, later Six Nations, developed a confederacy that would become one of the most powerful Native American political entities in North America. According to their oral tradition, carefully preserved through centuries of retelling, this union was born from the vision of a prophet known as the Peacemaker, or Deganawida, who worked alongside a man named Hiawatha, or Hiawatha in the Haudenosaunee language, to unite 5 warring nations: the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. The date of the Confederacy's founding is one of the most debated questions in Native American history. Some scholars, working primarily from archaeological evidence and analysis of European contact records, have placed the founding somewhere between 1450 and 1600 CE. However, Haudenosaunee oral tradition describes the Confederacy as existing from time immemorial. And some researchers, using a combination of oral history, astronomical references in the tradition, and archaeological data, have suggested dates as early as 1142 E, or even earlier. What we can say with certainty is that by the time Europeans began keeping detailed records in the 1600s, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was already well established, politically sophisticated, and wielding considerable power across a vast territory. The exact date of founding matters less than understanding what they built: a system of government based on consensus, representation, and balance of power that would endure for centuries and, some scholars argue, may have influenced the framers of the United States Constitution. The Great Law of Peace, the Constitution of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, established a Grand Council of 50 chiefs, or sachems, chosen by clan mothers from each of the 5 nations. These were not hereditary positions passed from father to son, but rather appointments made by women who held the power to install chiefs, and crucially, to remove them if they failed in their duties. This was a matrilineal society where kinship and inheritance flowed through the mother's line. The Confederacy was structured like their traditional longhouses, those bark-covered communal dwellings that could house entire extended families. The Mohawk were keepers of the eastern door, the Seneca guarded the western door, and the Onondaga in the center kept the sacred council fire. When the Tuscarora joined in the early 1700s, fleeing conflicts in the Carolinas, the Confederacy became the Six Nations, but the essential structure remained. Decisions in the Grand Council required consensus. All 50 chiefs had to agree before action could be taken. This system demanded patience, diplomacy, and the ability to build coalitions across different nations with different interests. It was democracy of a kind that Europeans, accustomed to kings and lords, struggled to understand. The Haudenosaunee controlled a vast territory stretching from the Hudson River to the Great Lakes, and from the St. Lawrence River to the Ohio Valley. They were masterful diplomats who would play French and British interests against each other for decades, maintaining their independence and power long after many other native nations had been subjugated. In the arid Southwest, the Pueblo peoples had been building their distinctive adobe villages for centuries. At Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, massive stone structures rose from the desert floor between 850 CE and 1150 CE. These were not simple dwellings, but carefully planned complexes, some containing hundreds of rooms, built with sophisticated knowledge of solar and lunar cycles. Roads radiated outward from Chaco to distant settlements, straight as arrows across dozens of miles, their purpose still debated by archaeologists. The Pueblo peoples developed intricate irrigation systems to farm corn, beans, and squash in an unforgiving environment. They wove cotton, made pottery of stunning beauty, and created art that blended spiritual symbolism with practical function. Their societies were organized around kivas, underground ceremonial chambers where religious rituals maintained the balance between the human and spirit worlds. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 1500s, they would find dozens of Pueblo villages scattered across the Rio Grande Valley and the mesas beyond, each one a testament to centuries of adaptation and survival in a harsh land. Along the Pacific Northwest coast, from what is now Northern California to Alaska, native nations built a different kind of civilization, one based not on agriculture but on the extraordinary abundance of the sea. The salmon runs that filled the rivers each year provided reliable protein that allowed populations to grow and complex social structures to develop. Nations like the Tlingit, Haida, Kwakwaka'wakw, and Coast Salish carved massive totem poles that recorded lineages and stories, built enormous cedar plank houses, and created art of breathtaking sophistication. These were not nomadic hunters barely scraping by. They were settled peoples with permanent villages, elaborate potlatch ceremonies where chiefs demonstrated their wealth and status through gift-giving, and social hierarchies that included nobles, commoners, and slaves. They traveled the coastal waters in cedar canoes, capable of carrying dozens of people or tons of goods, trading up and down the coast and into the interior. Their societies were as stratified and politically complex as any in the agricultural East, proof that indigenous North American civilizations took many forms, each adapted to its environment. This was the America that existed before contact, a continent of cities and villages, of trade networks spanning thousands of miles, of political confederacies and theocracies, of art and architecture, agriculture, and astronomy. It was a world as old as Europe, as diverse as Asia, and utterly distinct. The people who lived here were not primitive, not savage, not waiting for civilization to arrive. They had built their own civilizations, and those civilizations had been rising, falling, changing, and enduring for thousands of years before any European ever set foot on these shores. The first Europeans to reach North America came not in search of gold or glory, but simply because they were blown off course. Around the year 1000 CE, Norse seafarers from Greenland, led by a man named Leif Erikson, landed somewhere on the northeastern coast of North America. They called it Vinland, perhaps for the wild grapes they found growing there. At Lanceau Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland, archaeologists have found the remains of their settlement. 8 timber and sod buildings that housed perhaps 70 to 90 people for a brief time. The Norse encountered people they called Skraelings, indigenous inhabitants who initially traded with them, but eventually drove them away. The settlement at Lanceau Meadows was abandoned after just a few years. The Norse returned to Greenland with tales of a strange land across the sea, but they never established a permanent presence. Their brief contact with North America left no lasting impact on either the indigenous peoples or European knowledge of the continent. The encounter was recorded in sagas that most people in Europe never heard, and America remained unknown to the wider world for another 500 years. Everything changed in 1492 when Christopher Columbus, sailing for the Spanish crown, stumbled upon islands in the Caribbean while searching for a western route to Asia. Columbus died believing he had reached the Indies, never understanding that he had encountered an entirely separate landmass. But his voyages opened a floodgate. Within decades, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and English explorers were crisscrossing the Atlantic, mapping coastlines, claiming lands, and bringing back tales of the wealth to be found. The Spanish were first to establish permanent colonies in what would become the United States. In 1565, they founded St. Augustine in Florida, making it the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in the continental United States. From there, Spanish influence spread across a vast territory. Missions and presidios, fortified outposts combining religious and military functions, appeared across Florida, stretched through what is now the American Southwest from Texas to Arizona, and eventually extended into California in the 1700s. The Spanish brought with them a system honed through their conquests of the Caribbean, Mexico, and Central and South America, the encomienda and later the mission system, designed to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity while simultaneously extracting their labor and integrating them into the Spanish colonial economy. In New Mexico, Spanish colonists arrived in 1598 under the leadership of Don Juan de Oñate, establishing settlements along the Rio Grande among the Pueblo peoples who had been living in these agricultural communities for centuries. The Spanish colonial system operated through a combination of political control and religious conversion. Franciscan missionaries established missions in or near existing Pueblo villages, working aggressively to replace indigenous religious practices with Catholicism. They demanded tribute in the form of corn, cotton cloth, and labor. They suppressed Pueblo religious practices with a zeal that left no room for compromise, destroying kivas, the underground ceremonial chambers central to Pueblo spirituality, burning sacred objects, and publicly whipping or executing Pueblo religious leaders. Franciscan missionaries forced conversions to Catholicism, sometimes using physical punishment against those who resisted or who tried to maintain traditional practices in secret. For decades, the Pueblo peoples endured this systematic oppression, their resentment building generation after generation like water behind a dam. In 1680, that dam burst. A religious leader named Pope from Oke Owinge, also known as San Juan Pueblo, organized a coordinated uprising that swept across New Mexico with remarkable precision. The planning itself was a feat of organization. Pope managed to unite various Pueblo communities, who normally governed themselves independently, and coordinate their actions across hundreds of miles without the Spanish discovering the plot. Runners carried knotted cords to each pueblo, with knots marking the days until the uprising would begin. On August 10th, 1680, Pueblo warriors from dozens of communities attacked Spanish settlements simultaneously across the province, killing approximately 400 colonists and 21 of the 33 Franciscan missionaries stationed in New Mexico. The survivors, including Governor Antonio de Otermin, fled south to El Paso del Norte, modern-day Ciudad Juárez. For 12 years, the Pueblo peoples were free of Spanish rule, a period they used to destroy churches, burn Christian religious objects, perform purification rituals in the Rio Grande to wash away baptism, and attempt to erase every trace of the Spanish presence. The Spanish returned in 1692 under Diego de Vargas, who began a reconquest that took several years of fighting to complete. But the Pueblo Revolt had fundamentally changed the equation of power. The Spanish were more cautious now, somewhat less overtly oppressive in their treatment of Pueblo religion, though the missions and demands for tribute continued. They never fully regained the control they had exercised before 1680. The revolt stands as one of the most successful indigenous uprisings against European colonization in North American history, a demonstration that native peoples were not passive victims, but active agents who could and did fight back effectively when unified. The memory of the Pueblo Revolt would inspire later generations and serve as a reminder to Spanish authorities that there were limits to how far they could push their subjects. While Spain established its empire in the south and southwest, France carved out a different kind of colonial presence in North America. French explorers and fur traders penetrated deep into the interior of the continent, following the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi River system all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Jacques Cartier had explored the St. Lawrence in the 1530s, and Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec in 1608, the same year Jamestown was established in Virginia. But unlike the Spanish, who sought gold, silver, and souls to convert, or the English, who sought land for permanent agricultural settlement, the French primarily wanted one thing: furs, especially beaver pelts that could be made into felt for the fashionable hats that European gentlemen wore. The fur trade created a fundamentally different relationship between Europeans and native peoples than what developed in Spanish or English colonies. The fur trade required cooperation. French traders could not simply take furs, they had to trade for them, which meant maintaining good relationships with the native hunters and trappers who did the actual work of catching beavers, processing the pelts according to specific methods that made them suitable for felt making, and transporting them hundreds of miles to trading posts. This economic relationship led to cultural exchange and intermarriage on a scale unmatched in other European colonies. French traders, especially the coureurs de bois, independent traders who operated beyond official company control, lived among native communities for months or years at a time. They learned indigenous languages, adopted native clothing and survival techniques, and frequently married native women. These marriages created kinship networks that were economically valuable, providing traders with access to fur resources and diplomatic connections, while also creating mixed-race populations, the Métis, who would play important roles in the fur trade and in mediating between French and native interests. French Jesuit missionaries worked to convert native peoples, establishing missions in the Great Lakes region, along the Mississippi, and in what would become Illinois and Louisiana. The Jesuits' approach differed from the Spanish Franciscans in significant ways. While they certainly aimed to replace indigenous religious beliefs with Catholicism, many Jesuit missionaries learned native languages, studied indigenous cultures in detail, and sometimes showed more willingness to adapt Catholic practices to native customs. Their detailed reports, called the Jesuit Relations, provide invaluable historical information about Native American societies in the 1600s and 1700s, though these documents must be read critically since they were written from a European perspective with the goal of encouraging missionary support. New France, as the French called their North American empire, Empire, was always thinly populated compared to the English colonies along the Atlantic coast. The French crown and the companies it chartered were interested in extracting resources, not in sending large numbers of settlers. By the mid-1700s, while the English colonies along the Atlantic coast counted their populations in the hundreds of thousands, New France had perhaps 60 to 65,000 European inhabitants, most of them clustered in the St. Lawrence Valley around Quebec, Montreal, and Trois-Rivières. But French influence extended far beyond these settlements, carried by a network of trading posts, forts, and missions that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Appalachian Mountains to the Great Plains. The French understood that in order to maintain their empire against the larger and growing English colonial population, they needed native allies. They cultivated relationships with numerous nations, providing guns, metal tools, cloth, and other European goods in exchange for furs and military support. They allied with the Huron, Wendat, in the Great Lakes region, though this alliance was devastated when the Iroquois, armed by Dutch and later English traders, nearly destroyed the Huron in wars during the 1640s and 1650s. They maintained alliances with the Ottawa, Potawatomi, Illinois, Miami, and many other nations in the Great Lakes and Mississippi Valley regions. These alliances would prove crucial when France and Britain finally clashed for control of North America in the mid-17th century, giving France a military reach that seemed to defy the small size of its settler population. The English came late to the colonization game, but they came in numbers that would ultimately overwhelm their rivals. Their first successful settlement at Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607, nearly failed in its first years. Their vision of colonization differed fundamentally from that of the French or Spanish. The English wanted land, not just trade goods or souls. They came as families to establish permanent communities, to clear forests and plant crops, to recreate England on American soil. This brought them into direct and inevitable conflict with the indigenous peoples whose lands they claimed. On May the 14th, 1607, 3 English ships dropped anchor in a river they named the James, after their king. The 104 men and boys who came ashore had been sent by the Virginia Company of London, a joint stock company chartered by King James I, with the mission to establish a profitable colony and find a water route to the Pacific Ocean. They also hoped to find gold. They would find none of these things, at least not at first. What they found instead was death, disease, and desperation. The site they chose for their settlement was terrible. Jamestown sat on a marshy peninsula in the tidal portion of the James River, where the water was brackish and unfit for drinking half the year. The land was swampy, crawling with mosquitoes that carried malaria and other diseases. The men who landed were mostly gentlemen and their servants, unaccustomed to manual labor and ill-equipped for the brutal work of building a colony from scratch. They arrived too late in the season to plant crops, depending instead on trade with the local Puritan Confederacy for food. The Powhatan, led by their paramount chief Wahun Senakach, whom the English called Powhatan, watched these newcomers with a mixture of curiosity and concern. The English had built their fort on land the Powhatan considered virtually worthless, which is why they'd allowed it. But as it became clear the English intended to stay, tensions mounted. The Powhatan could have wiped out Jamestown in its first years, and at times they came close, laying siege to the fort and cutting off trade. The winter of 1609 to 1610 became known as the Starving Time, and the name was brutally earned. At the beginning of that winter, there were about 500 colonists in Jamestown, a number swelled by the recent arrival of new settlers that summer. By the spring of 1610, only 60 remained alive, a mortality rate of roughly 90%. Several factors combined to create this catastrophe. The summer supply mission had been disrupted when the flagship Sea Venture wrecked on Bermuda, delaying crucial supplies for nearly a year. The colonists were still largely dependent on trade with the Powhatan for food, but relations had broken down completely. Chief Powhatan laid siege to the fort, preventing the English from leaving to hunt, fish, or forage. Inside the fort, they ate their horses, their dogs, rats caught in the walls, and snakes. They boiled leather from shoes and belts, trying to extract any nutritional value. Archaeological evidence discovered in 2012 and 2013 confirmed what some written accounts had suggested, but many historians had dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration. Some colonists resorted to cannibalism. Researchers found the bones of a 14-year-old girl, identified as Jane, showing clear-cut marks and evidence that her brain had been removed and her flesh consumed shortly after death during that terrible winter. The survivors prepared to abandon the settlement in the spring, boarding ships and sailing downriver toward the ocean, intending to return to England as failures. But as fate would have it, they encountered an incoming fleet bringing the new governor, Thomas West, Lord Delaware, along with supplies and more settlers. Delaware ordered them back to Jamestown and implemented strict martial law to impose discipline. The colony survived, but just barely, and only through this providential encounter. What saved Jamestown, ultimately, was not gold or a route to the Pacific, but a plant, tobacco. In 1612, a settler named John Rolfe began experimenting with tobacco cultivation. The native tobacco of Virginia was bitter and harsh, unsuited to English tastes. But Rolfe managed to acquire seeds of Nicotiana tabacum, a sweeter variety from the Caribbean, and found that it grew beautifully in Virginia's soil and climate. By 1614, he had perfected his cultivation methods and sent the first shipment to England. The response was immediate and overwhelming. English demand for tobacco seemed insatiable. By 1617, colonists were shipping 20,000 pounds of tobacco annually to England. By 1630, that number had exploded to 500,000 pounds. Tobacco became currency in Virginia, used to pay taxes and debts. Men planted tobacco in every available plot, including the streets of Jamestown. The promise of tobacco wealth drew thousands of new settlers across the Atlantic. But tobacco was a brutally demanding crop. It required constant attention: planting, weeding, topping, cutting, curing. It exhausted the soil within 3 or 4 years, requiring constant clearing of new land. Most importantly, it required labor, and lots of it. The Virginia Company and later individual planters solved this problem through the headright system and indentured servitude. Anyone who paid for the passage of a worker to Virginia received 50 acres of land. The workers, mostly young men from England's lower classes, signed contracts binding them to labor for a term of 4 to 7 years, after which they would receive their freedom, some tools, and perhaps a small parcel of land. Tens of thousands of indentured servants poured into Virginia and Maryland in the 1600s. They lived harsh lives, working long hours in tobacco fields, poorly fed and often brutally treated. Many died before completing their terms. Those who survived faced a grim reality. The best land was already claimed by wealthy planters, and setting up a farm of one's own required resources most freed servants didn't have. They drifted to the frontier, squatted on lands claimed by native peoples, and nursed resentment against the planter elite who controlled Virginia's government and economy. The first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619. A Dutch ship put in at Point Comfort with about 20 Africans who had been captured from a Portuguese slave ship. They were sold to colonists, but their exact status was initially unclear. England had no tradition of chattel slavery, the system in which people were treated as property that could be bought and sold, and their children born into bondage. Some of these early Africans may have been treated more like indentured servants, working for a term of years before gaining freedom. But over the following decades, a horrifying transformation occurred. Virginia and Maryland began passing laws that created a system of racial slavery. A 1640 court case sentenced 3 runaway servants to punishment. 2 white men received extra years of service, but the third, a black man named John Punch, was sentenced to servitude for life. In 1662, Virginia passed a law declaring that children born in the colony would follow the condition of their mother. If she was enslaved, her children would be enslaved, regardless of the father's status. More laws followed, each one tightening the noose, each one making the distinction between black and white more rigid. In 1667, Virginia declared that conversion to Christianity did not confer freedom on enslaved people, removing a potential path to liberty. In 1670, the Colonial Assembly declared that all servants not being Christians imported into this colony by shipping shall be slaves for their lives. By not being Christians, they meant Africans, and this law effectively made slavery hereditary and racial. The transition from indentured servitude to racial slavery accelerated after an event that terrified Virginia's planter class: Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. Nathaniel Bacon was a wealthy young planter, cousin by marriage to Virginia's governor, William Berkeley. But Bacon and Berkeley despised each other. They disagreed about many things, but the immediate cause of conflict was policy toward Native Americans. After the Third Anglo-Powhatan War in 1644 to 1646, Virginia had pushed most native peoples to the margins, confining them to small reservations and taking vast tracts of land. But native raids still occurred on the frontier, and frontier settlers wanted permission to wage total war against all native peoples and seize their remaining lands. Berkeley resisted, partly because the fur trade with native peoples still brought him personal profit, partly because he feared a general Indian war would be ruinously expensive. Bacon, whose plantation sat on the frontier, demanded a commission to raise a militia and attack native peoples. When Berkeley refused, Bacon raised a force anyway. About 500 men, including white and black indentured servants, free blacks and enslaved people, all promised freedom if they joined. Bacon's militia attacked not just hostile native groups, but peaceful ones as well, massacring men, women, and children. The conflict spiraled out of control. Bacon and his followers marched on Jamestown, drove Berkeley out, and burned the capital to the ground in September 1676. Bacon issued a declaration of the people that accused Berkeley of corruption, of protecting wealthy friends at the expense of common people, and of favoring Native Americans over colonists. For a brief moment, Bacon's rebellion united poor whites, black servants, and enslaved people in armed rebellion against the planter elite. Then, Bacon died of dysentery in October 1676. Without his leadership, the rebellion collapsed. Berkeley returned with forces from England and crushed the remaining rebels. He hanged dozens of participants. But the rebellion had exposed a terrifying truth to the ruling class. Poor whites and enslaved blacks could make common cause. United, they were dangerous. The solution, as historian Edmund Morgan argued in his influential work American Slavery, American Freedom, was to divide them. In the years after Bacon's rebellion, Virginia's laws increasingly drew sharp racial lines. Slavery was hardened into a permanent hereditary condition for people of African descent, while poor whites were given small privileges, property rights, and the psychological benefit of belonging to a superior race, even if they remained economically marginal. The Virginia Slave Codes of 1705 codified this system. They defined as slaves all non-Christian servants brought into the colony and all children born to enslaved mothers, regardless of the father's race or status. They prohibited enslaved people from owning weapons, leaving their owner's property without permission, lifting a hand against a white person for any reason, or gathering in groups. They made it legal for masters to punish enslaved people by any means short of death, and even made it legal to kill an enslaved person in the process of punishing them, as long as it wasn't done with malice aforethought. These laws created a system of absolute control and terror, a society where skin color determined a person's fate from birth. And it worked, in the sense that poor whites never again united with enslaved blacks against the planter class. But it created a society built on violence and injustice, a society that would eventually tear itself apart. While Virginia pursued profit through tobacco, another group of English colonists sought something different in America: religious freedom and the chance to build what they called a city upon a hill, a model Christian community that would shine as an example to the world. These were the Pilgrims and Puritans, religious dissenters who found England's established church too corrupt, too Catholic in its ceremonies, too worldly in its concerns. The Pilgrims were separatists who believed the Church of England was beyond redemption. In 1620, about 100 of them, along with other passengers they called strangers, set sail on the Mayflower. They had intended to land in Virginia but were blown off course and ended up at Cape Cod in November, well into winter and far north of their intended destination. Before going ashore, 41 of the male passengers signed the Mayflower Compact, agreeing to form a government and abide by majority rule. It wasn't democracy as we understand it today. Women and servants had no voice, but it established the principle of self-government by consent. That first winter in Plymouth killed half the colonists. They had arrived too late to plant crops and knew little about surviving in New England's climate. Starvation and disease ravaged them. Survival came through the help of local Wampanoag people, particularly a man named Tisquantum, known as Squanto, who taught them to plant corn, fish, and hunt. In the fall of 1621, the colonists celebrated a harvest feast with their Wampanoag neighbors. The event mythologized as the first Thanksgiving. But Plymouth never grew large or prosperous. It was overshadowed by a much larger Puritan migration that began in 1630. The Puritans, unlike the Pilgrims, wanted to purify the Church of England from within rather than separate from it entirely. But when King Charles I began persecuting Puritan ministers and dismissing Parliament, thousands of Puritans decided to leave England and create their ideal society in New England. Led by John Winthrop, a wealthy lawyer and gentleman, about 1,000 Puritans arrived in Massachusetts Bay in 1630. Winthrop delivered a sermon either aboard the ship Arbella or shortly after landing, in which he declared, "We shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." The Puritans believed they had entered a covenant with God to create a godly community. If they succeeded, they would prosper. If they failed, God would punish them. The Massachusetts Bay Colony grew rapidly. Unlike the starving settlers of Jamestown, the Puritans came well-supplied and well-organized. They founded towns throughout eastern Massachusetts, each centered on a meeting house that served as both church and town hall. These towns practiced a form of direct democracy, with male church members meeting to elect selectmen and vote on town matters. But this was not religious freedom in any modern sense. The Puritans had fled persecution only to establish their own intolerant theocracy. Church and state were intertwined. Only male church members could vote or hold office. Attendance at church services was mandatory. Laws regulated behavior down to minute details. No drinking, no gambling, no fancy clothing, no celebrating Christmas, which they considered a papist corruption. Violators faced fines, public humiliation in the stocks, whipping, or even execution for serious offenses like heresy or witchcraft. Dissenters found no tolerance in Puritan New England. Roger Williams, a young minister, arrived in Massachusetts in 1631, full of radical ideas. He argued that the colonial charter was fraudulent because the king had no right to give away land that belonged to native peoples. He claimed that civil magistrates had no authority over matters of conscience, and that church and state should be separated. He denied that a government could punish people for breaking the first 4 of the 10 Commandments, those dealing with worship and belief, only the last 6, which dealt with interpersonal conduct. The Puritan leaders banished him in 1635. Williams fled south and purchased land from the Narragansett people. There he founded Providence, establishing a colony based on religious liberty and separation of church and state. Rhode Island became a haven for dissenters of all kinds: Baptists, Quakers, Jews, anyone seeking freedom of conscience. Anne Hutchinson posed a different kind of threat. She was a midwife and the wife of a wealthy merchant, intelligent, charismatic, and deeply religious. She began holding meetings in her home to discuss the weekly sermons. Her gatherings grew large, sometimes attracting 60 or more people. Hutchinson taught that believers could experience God directly through the Holy Spirit without mediation from ministers or churches. She implied that most Massachusetts ministers preached a covenant of works, salvation through good behavior, rather than the true covenant of grace, salvation by faith alone. This was heresy to the Puritan establishment. In 1637, the colonial government put her on trial. During her examination, Hutchinson defended herself brilliantly, citing scripture, matching wits with her interrogators. But then she claimed to have received direct revelations from God, and that sealed her fate. The court banished her to Rhode Island and later to New York, where she and most of her family were killed in a Native American attack in 1643. The Puritans' relationship with native peoples started peacefully, but deteriorated quickly. The 1616 to 1619 epidemic, probably smallpox or plague, brought by earlier European fishermen and traders, had devastated coastal native populations before the Puritans arrived. Some Puritan ministers saw this as divine providence, God clearing the land for his chosen people. But many native peoples remained, and the colonists' hunger for land brought inevitable conflict. The Pequot War of 1636 to 1638 marked the first major conflict. The Pequot controlled lucrative trade along the Connecticut River Valley, and English settlers moving into Connecticut threatened their dominance. Tensions escalated after the murder of an English trader. The Massachusetts and Connecticut colonies raised militias, allied with the Narragansett and Mohegan peoples, traditional enemies of the Pequot, and launched a brutal campaign. In May 1637, English and native forces surrounded the main Pequot fort near the Mystic River. At dawn, they set it on fire. As men, women, and children fled the burning fort, they were shot down or forced back into the flames. Between 400 and 700 Pequot died that morning. The Puritan commander, John Mason, wrote that God was pleased to smite our enemies in the hinder parts, and to give us their land for an inheritance. The surviving Pequot were hunted down, killed, or sold into slavery in the Caribbean. The war ended in the Pequot's near-total destruction. For nearly 40 years, an uneasy peace held between the English colonists and the remaining native peoples of New England. But the colonists' population grew exponentially, doubling every 25 years through immigration and natural increase. They spread across the land, founding new towns, clearing forests, and enclosing common lands. Native peoples found their hunting grounds shrinking, their access to resources cut off, their very way of life threatened. In 1675, Metacom, called King Philip by the English, led a desperate war of resistance. Metacom was the son of Massasoit, the Wampanoag leader who had helped the Pilgrims survive their first winter. But the Wampanoag had watched 50 years of English encroachment, and Metacom decided to fight back. He forged an alliance of native peoples throughout New England: Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Narragansett, and others. King Philip's War raged from 1675 to 1676 and was the bloodiest conflict in American history relative to population. Native warriors attacked more than half of New England's 90 towns, destroying 12 of them completely. They killed more than 600 colonists, and hundreds more died of war-related causes. But the colonists had numbers and resources the Native alliance could not match. English militias, aided by native allies from the praying towns, Christian converts who sided with the English, hunted down Metacom's forces relentlessly. In August 1676, a native informant led English soldiers to Metacom's hiding place in a swamp. He was shot and killed. The English cut off his head and displayed it on a pike in Plymouth, where it remained for 20 years. His wife and 9-year-old son were sold into slavery in the Caribbean. The war destroyed native power in southern New England. Those who survived were confined to small reservations, their populations devastated, their lands taken. It was a victory for the English, but a horrifyingly costly one. And it left New England traumatized for a generation. Between the Puritan strongholds of New England and the tobacco plantations of the Chesapeake lay a region that would become known for its diversity and relative tolerance. The Middle Colonies of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. These colonies attracted a wider variety of European settlers and developed economies based on grain production rather than tobacco or subsistence farming. New York began as New Netherland, a Dutch colony focused on the fur trade. The Dutch West India Company established Fort Amsterdam on Manhattan Island in 1624 and claimed the entire Hudson River Valley. Unlike the English, the Dutch showed little interest in large-scale settlement. New Amsterdam remained a small trading post with a polyglot population of Dutch, Walloons, French, Scandinavians, Germans, and enslaved Africans. Peter Stuyvesant, the last Dutch governor, ruled with an iron fist. But he could not prevent the colony's capture by the English. In 1664, 4 English warships appeared in New Amsterdam's harbour demanding surrender. Stuyvesant wanted to fight, but he had few soldiers, and the residents refused to take up arms for a company town they had little love for. New Netherland became New York without a shot fired. The English takeover brought changes but preserved much of the colony's diversity. The Duke of York, later King James II, granted the colony to himself and allowed Dutch residents to keep their property and worship as they pleased. The patroon system, which had granted vast estates to Dutch lords, continued under English rule. New York developed a pattern of large land holdings worked by tenant farmers, creating a more aristocratic society than in New England, but less dominated by a single crop than Virginia. Pennsylvania was different from the start. William Penn, a wealthy English Quaker, received the colony as payment for a debt King Charles II owed his father. Penn saw it as a chance to create a holy experiment, a place where Quakers and other religious minorities could live in peace and prosperity. Quakers, officially the Religious Society of Friends, were radicals who rejected hierarchical church structures, paid clergy, and elaborate rituals. They believed in the inner light, direct communication between the individual and God without need for intermediaries. They refused to swear oaths, doff their hats to social superiors, or serve in the military. In England, they faced persecution, imprisonment, fines, and physical abuse. Penn wanted Pennsylvania to be different. He drafted a frame of government that guaranteed religious liberty to all who believed in God, allowed all tax-paying men to vote, and established a representative assembly. He insisted on fair treatment of native peoples, purchasing land from the Lenni, Lenape, and Delaware nations before allowing settlement. His policies created relatively peaceful relations between colonists and native peoples that lasted decades, a sharp contrast to the violence in Virginia and New England. Pennsylvania attracted thousands of immigrants, not just English Quakers, but German Lutherans and Reformed Scots-Irish Presbyterians, Welsh Baptists, and others seeking religious freedom and economic opportunity. Philadelphia, founded in 1682, grew with astounding speed. By 1700, it rivaled Boston as the colony's largest city. By 1750, it was the largest city in British North America and one of the largest in the entire British Empire. The Middle Colonies became the breadbasket of America. The soil was fertile, the climate temperate, and farmers grew wheat, barley, and rye in abundance. They ground grain into flour at water-powered mills and shipped it to the Caribbean, Southern Europe, and anywhere else buyers could be found. This grain trade made the Middle Colonies prosperous and created a robust merchant class. The ethnic and religious diversity of the Middle Colonies stood in stark contrast to the relative homogeneity of New England or Virginia. Germans clustered in communities where they maintained their language and customs. Scots-Irish pushed to the frontier, bringing with them a fierce independence and a tradition of violence against native peoples. African slavery existed in the Middle Colonies, but never reached the proportions it did further south. Instead, the region relied more on free labor, family farms, and a thriving artisan class. This diversity created challenges. Without a dominant religious establishment, as in New England, or a dominant economic elite, as in Virginia, the Middle Colonies developed a more pluralistic political culture. Competing interests had to negotiate and compromise. It was messy and contentious, but it also created space for religious toleration and economic innovation that would make these colonies among the most prosperous in North America. By the early 1700s, the British colonies in North America were thoroughly integrated into a vast Atlantic trading network. Ships crossed the ocean constantly, carrying people, goods, ideas, and diseases. The colonies existed to enrich Britain, or so British policymakers believed, and they crafted laws designed to ensure that colonial trade benefited the mother country. The Navigation Acts, passed between 1651 and 1696, formed the legal framework of this mercantile system. They required that most goods shipped to or from the colonies travel on English or colonial ships, manned by English or colonial crews. They designated certain valuable colonial products, enumerated goods like tobacco, sugar, rice, and indigo, which could only be shipped to England or other English colonies, not to foreign ports. They required most European goods bound for the colonies to pass through England first, where they could be taxed. These laws benefited English merchants, shipbuilders, and the royal treasury. They gave colonial shipbuilders and sailors a monopoly on trade within the empire. But they also constrained colonial economic development, forcing colonists to sell their products in restricted markets and buy manufactured goods at inflated prices. In practice, the Navigation Acts were unevenly enforced. Colonial merchants evaded them when profitable and convenient. Smuggling became a respected profession in port cities like Boston and New York. Officials could be bribed, and the vast American coastline offered countless places to land contraband. The Crown lacked the resources to police every harbor and cove. But within this legal and illegal framework, a complex colonial economy developed. New England, with its rocky soil and harsh climate, turned to the sea. Fishing boats harvested cod from the Grand Banks. Ships carried timber, fish, and other products to the Caribbean and southern Europe, and merchants organized the trade that linked all these activities. Yankee traders became famous for their sharp dealing and their willingness to bend rules. The Middle Colonies, as mentioned, exported grain and flour. They also developed an iron industry, mining ore and operating furnaces that produced iron bars and simple implements. Philadelphia emerged as a financial center, with merchants extending credit to farmers and shopkeepers throughout the region. The Chesapeake exported tobacco above all else. Planters shipped enormous hogsheads of tobacco to London and Bristol, where it was sold, taxed, and often re-exported to Europe. In return came manufactured goods: cloth, furniture, tools, luxuries. Many planters fell into debt to British merchants, buying on credit against future tobacco crops. This debt would become a source of bitter resentment as the Revolution approached. The Lower South, particularly South Carolina, developed a different economy based on rice and indigo. Rice cultivation required elaborate systems of dikes and flooding, knowledge that enslaved Africans from rice-growing regions of West Africa possessed. They were not just labor, but experts whose skills made rice cultivation possible. Indigo, a plant that produced blue dye, became a valuable cash crop after Eliza Lucas Pinckney successfully cultivated it in the 1740s. Underlying all this was the Atlantic slave trade. British ships carried manufactured goods, textiles, rum, and guns to West Africa, where they were traded for enslaved people. These captives were packed into the holds of slave ships and transported across the Atlantic in what became known as the Middle Passage, a voyage of horror that killed between 10 and 20% of those aboard. Enslaved Africans who survived were sold in American ports and forced to work on plantations. The products of their labor, sugar, tobacco, rice, were shipped to Europe, completing what historians call the triangular trade. This system enriched British merchants, colonial planters, and European consumers. It devastated West African societies and condemned millions to slavery and their descendants to generations of bondage. Between 1619 and 1808, when the United States banned the international slave trade, hundreds of thousands of Africans were brought to British North America and later the United States. Their labor built the colonial economy, particularly in the South. Slavery varied across the colonies. In New England, slavery existed but remained relatively rare. Enslaved people worked as domestic servants, dock workers, or skilled artisans. In the Middle Colonies, slavery was more common but still not dominant. In the Chesapeake, enslaved people made up 40% of the population by 1750, working primarily in tobacco cultivation. In South Carolina, enslaved people formed the majority of the population, sometimes outnumbering whites 2 or 3 to 1. The slave codes that began in Virginia spread throughout the South, creating a system of legalized oppression. Enslaved people had no legal rights. They could be bought and sold, families torn apart at the whim of an owner. They could be punished by whipping, branding, mutilation, or death, with little or no legal recourse. They could not own property, testify in court against a white person, or learn to read and write. Yet enslaved people resisted, they ran away, despite the brutal punishments awaiting those who were caught. They formed maroon communities in swamps and mountains. They practiced African cultural traditions in secret, preserving languages, religions, and customs that would evolve into African American culture. They slowed their work, broke tools, and engaged in small acts of sabotage. And sometimes they rose in open rebellion. In 1739, near the Stono River in South Carolina, about 20 enslaved people seized weapons from a store, killed the storekeepers, and began marching south towards Spanish Florida, which offered freedom to runaways from British colonies. Their number grew to perhaps 100 as they marched, burning plantations and killing white colonists. A militia intercepted them, killing more than 40 in the fighting. Those captured were executed, their heads placed on stakes along the road as a warning. The Stono Rebellion terrified South Carolina's white population. The Colonial Assembly passed even harsher slave codes, forbade teaching enslaved people to read, restricted their movements further, and increased slave patrols. But the rebellion also demonstrated that enslaved people would fight for their freedom when the opportunity arose. By the mid-17th century, colonial society had developed distinct characteristics that would have profound implications for the future. A hierarchical social structure existed in all colonies, but its exact form varied. In the South, a planter aristocracy dominated, controlling vast estates worked by enslaved people and wielding disproportionate political power. In the Middle Colonies, a more diverse society included wealthy merchants, prosperous farmers, artisans, laborers, and enslaved people. In New England, while some families achieved wealth and prominence, Puritan values of community and rough equality persisted, at least among white men. But everywhere, literacy was spreading. Public education existed in New England, where Massachusetts required towns to establish schools. In the Middle and Southern colonies, education was more haphazard depending on private tutors or church-run schools. But reading materials circulated widely. Newspapers appeared in major cities by the 1720s, carrying news from Europe, other colonies, and local matters. Colonists read pamphlets, almanacs like Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac, and imported books. Ideas traveled, and people increasingly saw themselves as participating in a broader Atlantic world of commerce and ideas. Political participation was limited but real. Colonial assemblies modeled on parliament existed in each colony. Only property-owning men could vote, which excluded women, the poor, enslaved people, and often free black people. But the proportion of white men who owned enough property to vote was higher in the colonies than in England, creating a broader electorate. These assemblies controlled taxation and spending, giving them leverage against royal governors who represented the crown's interests. colonial assemblies fought constantly with governors over power and prerogatives. Who controlled the governor's salary? Who appointed judges and officials? Who could call and dismiss the assembly? These struggles created a tradition of representative government, defending colonial rights against executive authority, a tradition that would be invoked when colonists later resisted British policies. Into this evolving society came a religious upheaval that would shake the foundations of colonial culture and plant seeds that would influence American society for generations: the Great Awakening. Beginning in the 1730s and reaching its peak in the 1740s, this revival movement swept through the colonies like wildfire, transforming how people understood religion, authority, and their relationship with God. The roots of the Great Awakening can be traced to earlier evangelical movements in Europe and to local revivals in places like Northampton, Massachusetts, where Minister Jonathan Edwards delivered sermons that emphasized human depravity and divine grace with such emotional intensity that his congregation experienced waves of religious conversion. Edwards's most famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, delivered in 1741, depicted unconverted sinners as spiders dangling by a thread over the fires of hell, held back only by God's mercy. People reportedly wept, fainted, and cried out in terror and repentance. This emotional, experiential approach to religion stood in stark contrast to the more intellectual, formal worship that had characterized much of colonial religion, especially in New England, where Puritan ministers delivered complex theological lectures to their congregations. The Great Awakening's most famous preacher was George Whitefield, an English evangelist whose charisma and theatrical preaching style made him perhaps the first true celebrity in American history. Whitefield had a voice that contemporaries reported could be heard clearly by audiences of 30,000 people in outdoor settings, a claim that Benjamin Franklin tested and found plausible. Whitefield toured the colonies repeatedly between 1739 and 1770, preaching in open fields, marketplaces, and anywhere else crowds would gather. He drew thousands wherever he went, people from all social classes, ages, and backgrounds coming together to hear his message. His ability to preach extemporaneously, to speak to the heart rather than the head, to make religion feel immediate and personal rather than distant and intellectual, revolutionized colonial religion. Whitefield's message was emotional and direct. Salvation came not through belonging to the right church, not through performing the right rituals, not through being born into the right family, but through a personal conversion experience, a moment when the individual sinner felt God's grace washing over them and was born again. This was democratic in a way that traditional colonial religion was not. It said that a wealthy merchant and a poor laborer, a Harvard graduate and an illiterate farmer stood on equal ground before God. All were sinners, and all could be saved through faith and God's grace alone. Whitefield and other itinerant preachers like Gilbert Tennant, who delivered a controversial sermon called The Danger of an Unconverted Ministry, arguing that many established ministers were themselves unsaved and therefore unfit to lead congregations. And James Davenport, whose emotional excesses eventually led even other revival preachers to distance themselves from him, challenged established churches and their educated clergy in ways that seemed shocking and dangerous to religious authorities. They preached that formal theological training mattered less than the fire of personal faith, that a converted farmer with no education could understand God's will, as well as a Harvard-educated minister with years of study. They encouraged people to trust their own religious experiences, the inner testimony of the Holy Spirit, rather than deferring blindly to religious authorities who might themselves be unconverted. This was radical and deeply destabilizing to established power structures, In New England, the Great Awakening split congregational churches between New Lights, who embraced the revivals as a genuine work of God renewing the church, and Old Lights, who rejected them as dangerous enthusiasm and emotional disorder that threatened proper church governance and theological orthodoxy. Some churches split entirely, with New Light members leaving to form separate congregations. In the Middle Colonies, the revival energized Presbyterians, leading to divisions between Old Side and New Side factions, and created numerous new Baptist congregations as people who had experienced conversion sought out churches that matched their new religious intensity. In the South, Baptist and Methodist preachers began making inroads among both white and black populations, offering a more emotional and egalitarian form of Christianity than the established Anglican Church. Slaveholders viewed these developments with deep suspicion, worried about any religion that suggested all souls were equal before God and that encouraged enslaved people to gather for religious meetings that masters could not control. The Great Awakening had several important long-term consequences that extended far beyond its immediate religious impact. First, it challenged hierarchy and authority in general, not just religious authority. If ordinary people could interpret Scripture and experience God directly without institutional mediation, what did that suggest about their ability to make decisions in other areas of life? The revival's emphasis on individual judgment and personal experience, while focused on religion, could easily extend to political and social questions. Second, it created new denominations and new patterns of religious organization. Baptists, Methodists, and various evangelical groups grew rapidly in the wake of the Awakening, creating a more diverse and competitive religious marketplace. Third, it spread a sense of shared experience across the colonies. For the first time, people in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Georgia all participated in the same religious movement at the same time, heard the same traveling preachers, or read accounts of the same revivals, sang the same hymns, and felt connected to fellow believers in other colonies. This created bonds and communication networks that would later prove important in the Revolutionary period. The Great Awakening also inspired social action and institutional creation. Some converts became passionate about education, believing that people needed to be able to read the Bible for themselves. The revival led to the founding of several colleges. The College of New Jersey, which would become Princeton University, was founded in 1746 by New Light Presbyterians. The College of Rhode Island, later Brown University, was founded by Baptists in 1764. Queen's College, later Rutgers University, was founded by Dutch Reformed ministers in 1766, and Dartmouth College was founded in 1769, originally to educate Native Americans and train missionaries. Others became interested in moral reform and social justice. Some awakening preachers, like Samuel Hopkins, began to question slavery, arguing that it was fundamentally incompatible with Christian virtue, and that Christians who claimed to love God while enslaving their fellow human beings were hypocrites. These were definitely minority voices in the 1740s and 1750s, and many revival preachers, including Whitefield himself, owned enslaved people and saw no contradiction between evangelical Christianity and slavery. But the seeds of religious anti-slavery sentiment were planted during the Great Awakening, and they would grow in the following decades, eventually becoming a powerful force in American abolitionism. Yet colonial society remained deeply stratified and fundamentally unjust. The prosperity of the colonies, particularly the southern colonies, rested on slavery. By 1750, about 250,000 enslaved Africans lived in the British colonies, and their numbers were growing rapidly. In South Carolina and parts of Virginia, they outnumbered free people. The slave system was not a peripheral feature of colonial life, but its economic foundation. That foundation showed cracks. Individual acts of resistance were constant: arson, poisoning, running away. Collective resistance was rarer, but never entirely absent. The fear of slave rebellion haunted slaveholders, shaping their laws, their social structures, their very psychology. They knew, at some level, that the system they had built was unstable, maintained only through violence and the threat of violence. Meanwhile, tensions with native peoples continued to simmer along the frontier. As colonists pushed westward, they encountered peoples who had no intention of giving up their lands peacefully. The French, from their bases in Canada and the Mississippi Valley, cultivated alliances with many of these nations, providing trade goods and weapons, and encouraging them to resist British expansion. By the 1750s, the stage was set for a massive conflict that would reshape North America and set in motion the chain of events leading to American independence. The war that would change everything began not in Europe, but in the forests of western Pennsylvania. In 1753, the colony of Virginia claimed the Ohio River Valley as part of its territory under its colonial charter. France, which controlled Canada and Louisiana, claimed the same region as part of New France. Both empires wanted control of the Ohio country for its fur trade and its strategic position between their North American holdings. Robert Dinwiddie, Virginia's lieutenant governor, sent a young militia officer named George Washington to warn the French to leave. Washington was 21 years old, ambitious, and utterly unequipped for what lay ahead. He delivered his warning to the French at Fort Le Boeuf in December 1753. The French commander politely refused to leave. The following spring, Virginia sent Washington back with a small force to reinforce a Virginia fort being built at the forks of the Ohio River, where Pittsburgh now stands. But the French got there first with a larger force, ejected the Virginians, and built Fort Duquesne. Washington, marching through the wilderness with about 150 men, encountered a French scouting party on May 28, 1754. In the brief fight that followed, 10 Frenchmen were killed, including their commander, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. The French claimed Jumonville had been on a diplomatic mission and that his killing was murder. Washington claimed self-defense. Either way, the incident sparked a war that would engulf not just North America, but Europe, the Caribbean, Africa, India, and the Philippines. The 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War. The war went badly for Britain at first. In 1755, General Edward Braddock led a massive expedition to capture Fort Duquesne, confident that European military discipline and firepower would easily overwhelm any opposition. His force of about 2,000 British regulars and colonial militia, including young George Washington serving as a volunteer aide, marched through the wilderness in traditional European parade ground formation, bright red coats visible for miles, drums beating, flags flying. On July 9th, 1755, about 8 miles from Fort Duquesne, French forces and their native allies, numbering fewer than 900 men, ambushed Braddock's column as it crossed the Monongahela River. The French and their allies fought from behind trees and rocks, using tactics suited to forest warfare. The British formation, trained for European battlefields, disintegrated into chaos. Officers on horseback made easy targets. Soldiers fired wildly into the smoke-filled forest, hitting their own men as often as the enemy. Braddock was mortally wounded, shot through the lung. Washington, serving as Braddock's aide, had 2 horses shot from under him and 4 bullet holes in his coat, but miraculously survived. Of the approximately 1,300 British and colonial soldiers engaged, nearly 1,000 were killed or wounded. The British retreated in complete chaos, abandoning their artillery, supplies, and wounded, leaving the entire western frontier open to French and native attacks. The defeat shattered British prestige and demonstrated that European military tactics were ill-suited to North American warfare. For the next few years, French forces and their native allies won victory after victory. Fort Oswego on Lake Ontario fell to French assault in 1756. Fort William Henry on Lake George fell in 1757 after a siege, followed by a massacre when France's native allies, against French wishes, attacked the surrendering British garrison, killing and capturing hundreds in violation of the surrender terms. The war seemed lost, and colonists throughout the frontier fled east, abandoning farms and settlements to French and native raids. Thousands of colonial farmers and their families became refugees in eastern towns. Then, in 1757, William Pitt became Britain's Secretary of State and took control of the war effort. Pitt understood that North America was the key to the larger global conflict with France, and he was willing to spend whatever it took to win. He poured money and men into the American theater on an unprecedented scale, reimbursing colonies for the costs of raising and equipping troops, which had been a major colonial complaint, and sending regular British forces in numbers never before seen in America. He coordinated campaigns across multiple fronts and selected aggressive commanders who would take the fight to the French rather than sitting in defensive positions. The tide turned dramatically. In 1758, the British captured Louisbourg, the massive fortress guarding the mouth of the St. Lawrence River and the gateway to Canada. Later that same year, British forces under General John Forbes finally captured Fort Duquesne, which they renamed Fort Pitt after the Prime Minister. The French, realizing they could not hold it, had burned it and retreated before Forbes arrived. In 1759 came the decisive campaign. General James Wolfe led an army up the St. Lawrence River to Quebec City, the heart of French Canada. After a summer of failed attacks against the heavily fortified city perched on cliffs above the river, Wolfe gambled everything on a daring night assault. His troops climbed a supposedly unscalable cliff path in the dark, surprising the French defenders and forcing a battle on the plains of Abraham outside the city walls. In the battle that followed on September 13, 1759, both Wolfe and the French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, were mortally wounded. Both would die within hours of the battle's end, but the British won and Quebec surrendered 5 days later. In 1760, Montreal, the last major French stronghold in Canada, fell to a converging British attack from 3 directions. New France had been conquered. After more than a century and a half, the French Empire in North America had effectively ended. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763, gave Britain all French territory east of the Mississippi River and Florida from Spain, which had unwisely entered the war on France's losing side. In return, Spain received French Louisiana, everything west of the Mississippi. France was expelled from mainland North America entirely. It was a stunning victory for Britain and a transformation of the balance of power. But victory brought unexpected problems. The war had been enormously expensive. Britain's national debt had doubled. Maintaining an army in North America to defend the newly conquered territories would cost even more. British officials looked at the colonies, which had benefited from British protection, and decided they should help pay the bill. Native peoples in the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes region looked at the British victory with alarm. The French had been difficult but relatively respectful allies, interested in trade rather than land. The British settlers had a different pattern. They came to stay, clearing forests, planting farms, and pushing native peoples aside. With the French gone, these peoples lost their most powerful ally. In 1763, a coalition of native peoples led by the Ottawa war leader Pontiac launched a coordinated uprising. They attacked British forts throughout the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley, capturing 8 of them and killing hundreds of settlers. The British eventually suppressed the rebellion, but it cost time, money, and lives. More importantly, it convinced British officials that westward expansion needed to be controlled to avoid future conflicts. In October 1763, King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763, declaring that colonists could not settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. The land beyond was reserved for native peoples. The proclamation was meant to reduce conflict and allow Britain to manage westward expansion in an orderly, profitable way. Colonists were outraged. They had fought in the war partly for the promise of Western lands. Veterans expected land grants. Speculators had invested in Western land companies. Squatters were already living beyond the mountains. The proclamation seemed to deny them the fruits of victory. Many simply ignored it, crossing the mountains anyway. But it created resentment and a sense that British interests did not align with colonial interests. Then come the taxes, and with them, a crisis that would ultimately lead to revolution. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act, which actually lowered the existing duty on molasses, imported from non-British sources, but crucially included provisions for strict enforcement that had been lacking before. The Act gave Royal Navy vessels and customs officials new powers to search ships and warehouses for smuggled goods and established vice admiralty courts, which operated without juries, to try smuggling cases. These courts removed the protection colonists had enjoyed when sympathetic local juries refused to convict their neighbors of customs violations. Colonial merchants, especially those in New England who had grown wealthy partly through evading customs duties, howled in protest. They began to articulate arguments that would become central to the revolutionary cause. Parliament had no right to tax them without their consent, and since they had no representatives in Parliament to give that consent, parliamentary taxation violated their rights as Englishmen. No taxation without representation became their rallying cry. But the protests remained relatively limited to merchants, lawyers, and political leaders. Most colonists weren't directly affected by the Sugar Act, and life went on much as before. The Stamp Act of 1765 was fundamentally different and provoked a reaction that shocked both Parliament and the colonists themselves with its intensity and violence. This law required colonists to purchase special stamped paper manufactured in London for all legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, almanacs, playing cards, and dice. Every court document, every deed transferring property, every will, every license, every newspaper, every advertisement, even every deck of cards required this special stamped paper. The tax wasn't particularly high, ranging from a halfpenny to several pounds depending on the document, but it was the first direct internal tax Parliament had ever levied on the colonies, and it affected nearly everyone. Lawyers needed it for legal documents, merchants for business papers, printers for newspapers and pamphlets, students for college diplomas, anyone involved in legal transactions. Even farmers buying land or writing wills needed stamped paper. Unlike the Sugar Act, which affected primarily merchants, the Stamp Act touched every level of colonial society. The reaction was explosive and coordinated in ways that surprised everyone. In Boston, a mob calling themselves the Sons of Liberty hanged an effigy of Andrew Oliver, the designated stamp distributor for Massachusetts, from a tree that became known as the Liberty Tree. They then destroyed a building Oliver owned and trashed his home, forcing him to resign. Similar protests erupted in cities throughout the colonies. In Newport, Rhode Island, stamp distributors were hanged in effigy. In New York, angry crowds destroyed the home of a British officer who had supported the act. In Charleston, stamp distributors were intimidated into resigning. Within months, every single stamp distributor in the colonies had resigned rather than face mob violence, and not a single stamp was ever sold for use in the colonies. The act became effectively impossible to enforce. But colonists went beyond violence and intimidation. They organized sophisticated boycotts of British goods, with merchants in major ports agreeing not to import British products until the act was repealed. Women organized spinning bees to produce homespun cloth rather than buy British textiles, making opposition to the Stamp Act a patriotic virtue. Non-importation agreements spread through the colonies, enforced by social pressure and public shaming of anyone who continued to buy British goods. British exports to the colonies dropped by about 14% in 1765, and angry British merchants whose businesses were suffering began lobbying Parliament for repeal. In October 1765, representatives from 9 colonies met in New York for what became known as the Stamp Act Congress, the first coordinated intercolonial political action of its kind. This was remarkable, because the colonies rarely cooperated on anything and had no formal mechanism for doing so. The Congress issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, asserting that only colonial assemblies could tax colonists, that trial by jury was a fundamental right that vice-admiralty courts violated, and that the Stamp Act was unconstitutional. They were careful to affirm their allegiance to the king and their acceptance of Parliament's authority to regulate trade, but they drew a clear line. Taxation was off-limits, without colonial consent. Parliament, shocked by the violent resistance and lobbied by British merchants whose businesses were hemorrhaging money, repealed the Stamp Act in March 1766. Colonists celebrated with bonfires, parades, and toasts to the king and Parliament. But Parliament's retreat came with a sting in its tail. On the same day it repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, which asserted Parliament's right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Parliament had backed down tactically, but insisted it retained full authority to tax and legislate for the colonies if it chose to do so. This set up a fundamental constitutional conflict that would prove impossible to resolve. Colonists believed they could only be taxed by their own elected representatives in colonial assemblies, while Parliament insisted it had supreme authority over all British subjects, including those in America. Both sides had principles they would not compromise, and the stage was set for future confrontations. The next attempt came in 1767 with the Townshend Acts, which placed duties on imported goods like glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. The revenue would pay the salaries of royal governors and judges, making them independent of colonial assemblies. The acts also created new courts and customs offices to enforce trade regulations. Again, colonists protested. Again, they organized boycotts. Colonial merchants agreed not to import British goods. Women organized spinning bees to make homespun cloth rather than buy British textiles. In Boston, tensions escalated. British soldiers had been stationed in the city to intimidate protesters, and Bostonians resented their presence. On March 5, 1770, a crowd surrounded a small group of soldiers and pelted them with snowballs, ice, and oyster shells. The soldiers fired into the crowd, killing 5 men. The Boston Massacre, as it was immediately called, became a propaganda tool for colonial radicals like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere, who depicted it as evidence of British tyranny. Faced with another effective boycott and escalating unrest, Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties in 1770. But they kept the tax on tea as a symbol of their authority to tax. For the next 3 years, an uneasy calm settled over the colonies. Trade resumed. Protests died down. Some historians call this the period of quiet before the storm. The Tea Act of 1773 reignited the crisis. The British East India Company, which held a monopoly on tea imports to Britain, was on the verge of bankruptcy. Parliament gave it the right to sell tea directly to the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants. This would make tea cheaper, even with the tax, than smuggled tea. Parliament thought colonists would be pleased. They were not. Colonial merchants saw their businesses threatened. Colonial radicals saw a trick: cheap tea designed to make them accept taxation and the principle behind it. In ports throughout the colonies, protesters prevented tea ships from unloading. In Boston, Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to send the ships back to England. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of men, some disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of tea worth thousands of pounds into the water. The Boston Tea Party was an act of defiance and destruction of property on a massive scale. Parliament's response was swift and harsh. In 1774, it passed what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. The Boston Port Act closed Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Government Act revoked the colony's charter and restricted town meetings. The Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain, and the Quartering Act required colonists to house British soldiers. These laws were meant to isolate and punish Massachusetts as an example to other colonies. They had the opposite effect. Other colonies saw Massachusetts's punishment as a threat to their own liberties. If Parliament could revoke one colony's charter, it could revoke any colony's charter. If it could close one port, it could close any port. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the Intolerable Acts united the colonies. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies, all except Georgia, met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They were not revolutionaries, not yet. Most still hoped for reconciliation with Britain, but they agreed to support Massachusetts and resist the Intolerable Acts. They issued a Declaration of Rights, asserting that colonists possessed the same rights as Englishmen. They organized a new boycott of British goods, more comprehensive than any before. They agreed to meet again if their grievances were not addressed. Events moved rapidly. In Massachusetts, colonists began organizing militia companies, the Minutemen, ready to fight at a moment's notice. They gathered weapons and ammunition, stockpiling them in towns like Concord. British General Thomas Gage, the military governor, knew about these preparations. In April 1775, he decided to act. On the night of April 18, 1775, Gage sent about 700 British soldiers to march from Boston to Concord to seize colonial military supplies. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott rode through the night warning the countryside that the British were coming. When the British reached Lexington at dawn on April 19th, they found about 70 militiamen assembled on the town green. Someone, no one knows who, fired a shot. Then both sides fired. 8 militiamen died, 10 were wounded. The British marched on to Concord. At Concord's North Bridge, a larger force of militia confronted the British. This time the fighting was more sustained. The militia drove the British back. As the British retreated toward Boston, Militiamen from surrounding towns poured in, firing from behind trees, stone walls, and buildings. The British march became a running battle. By the time they reached Boston, the British had suffered 273 casualties. The militia had lost 93 men. The American Revolution had begun. Over the following weeks, thousands of militiamen from throughout New England converged on Boston, surrounding the city and trapping Gage's army inside. In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. This time they took more decisive action. They created the Continental Army and appointed George Washington, the wealthy Virginia planter and French and Indian War veteran, as its commander-in-chief. On June 17, 1775, British forces and colonial militia clashed at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The British won, but at a terrible cost, over 1,000 casualties to fewer than 500 for the colonists. The battle demonstrated that colonial forces could stand against British regulars. Through the summer and fall of 1775, the situation deteriorated. King George III declared the colonies in rebellion. Parliament forbade all trade with them. British ships blockaded American ports. And yet, remarkably, most colonists still hoped for reconciliation. They blamed bad ministers and corrupt officials, not the king or the British system itself. That changed in 1776. Thomas Paine, an English radical who had arrived in America just 2 years earlier, published a pamphlet called Common Sense in January. In clear, forceful language, he argued that reconciliation was impossible, that the very idea of monarchy was absurd, and that America should declare independence and create a republic. Common Sense sold an estimated 150,000 copies in its first year, an astounding number for a population of only 2.5 million. It shifted public opinion dramatically, making independence thinkable, then desirable, then inevitable. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, drafted by Thomas Jefferson. It proclaimed that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. When a government becomes destructive of these ends, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. These were radical ideas, revolutionary ideas. They would inspire movements for freedom and democracy around the world for centuries. But they also contained contradictions. Many of the men who signed the Declaration owned enslaved people. The document's vision of equality did not include women, enslaved people, or Native Americans. The revolution that began in 1775 was about independence and self-government. But the question of who would be included in that self-governing community remained deeply contested. And so the colonies stood in the summer of 1776, no longer British subjects, but Americans, committed to a war they had not started, but now embraced, fighting for independence and a new kind of government. The road from Cahokia to the Continental Congress had been long, winding through centuries of indigenous civilization, European colonization, brutal enslavement, religious fervor, and political awakening. What would come next was uncertain, but the 13 colonies had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Thank you for listening tonight. If you enjoyed this journey through colonial America, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Until next time, sleep well.